In a wire compound behind the American lines, a Japanese flyer sat with nothing left to do but answer questions. His flight suit was still stiff with dried salt. He had been pulled out of the water after his aircraft came apart around him, and now an interpreter was working through him in careful phrases, asking him to walk back through the last minute before he went into the sea. He could account for the run-in. He could sketch the ships, their size, and their formation. What he could not explain, what almost none of them could ever quite put into words, was how the fire had found him so fast. That question outlived the war, not how many guns a ship carried or how large they were, but how the shells arrived on a diving aircraft within a minute of the moment it was first seen, and stayed on it while it twisted and burst around it without ever needing to touch it. The men who flew into that fire came back baffled on the rare occasions they came back at all. The thing they had flown into was not a gun and not a gunner. It was a process, and the process had been solving the question of where they were going to be while they still believed no one had found them. Consider a morning early in 1943 in the waters off Guadalcanal. A small group of dive bombers came in on an American cruiser force that was heading home from a night bombardment of a Japanese airfield up the coast at Munda. The bombers were good at their work, and they were quick. And they came over the ships before the gunners had a clean look at them. One even landed a hit. Then the group turned and ran, which was the sensible thing to do, because a dive bomber that has dropped its load and is fleeing low and fast is a hard, shrinking target moving away, the kind of shot that gun crews had always waved off as a waste of ammunition. The cruiser fired at them anyway. 2 salvos of 5-inch shells chased the retreating aircraft out over the water. On the 3rd salvo, one of the fleeing bombers fell out of the sky. Nothing had hit it. That was the part the men on both sides kept turning over afterward. The shell had not struck the plane at all. It had passed near it, close but not touching, and then it had opened, throwing a dense cloud of fragments through the air the plane was flying through, and that had been enough. To the crews in the water and the crews still aloft, it looked as though American shells had learned to reach out sideways, a near miss, which across the entire history of anti-aircraft fire had meant a miss, and nothing more had somehow become a hit. Move forward in the war and change the witness. Picture a crew in a land-based torpedo bomber coming in low over a black sea at night because darkness had always been the one dependable friend they had. After sunset, the optical rangefinders aboard the ships were blind. After sunset, the gunners were reduced to shooting at engine flames and educated guesses. A torpedo plane that pressed its attack in the dark, skimming the surface, was flying through the safest hours it knew. The fire came anyway. It reached out from ships that should not have been able to see them at all, arriving at the right altitude and the right bearing while the bombers were still well out, as though the night had been switched off. A device aboard those ships was fixing their position where the human eye was useless. The thing had a name by then, though the air crews rarely lived long enough to learn it. The ships were finding them by radar. But radar alone only reports that a target is out there at a certain range and bearing. It does not put a shell into the piece of sky the target is flying toward. For that, there had to be something more, deeper in the hull, doing arithmetic in the dark. By the 1944, the pattern had set into something an entire generation of Japanese naval aircrew would fly into and mostly not fly back out of. Off the Marianas in June, the Japanese carrier fleet flung wave after wave at the American task force. Radar caught each wave far out, while the attackers were still the better part of 100 miles away, and the fighters took most of them over open water, in plain sight of the fleet they had come to sink. The planes that slipped past the fighters had a second gauntlet to cross. Ahead of the carriers stood a screen of battleships and cruisers, stretched across the front of the formation for exactly this purpose. And the screen did not fire the way anti-aircraft guns had fired earlier in the war, in hopeful barrages flung up to make a patch of sky dangerous. The screen fired aimed. Bursts opened on single machines, followed them through their turns, walked along behind them. Flyers near the tail of the surviving formations could look back and see a line of small glowing marks strung across the water, one after another, where the men who had not made it had gone in. The thing those flyers had been fighting sat well below the waterline, in a sealed compartment called the plotting room. Bolted to the deck, there was a machine that weighed more than 1.5 tons. It was not a computer, in the sense the word carries now. It was a dense city of gears and cams and shafts and spinning discs, an analog calculator that solved its problem in one continuous unbroken motion, modeled in brass and steel. Its task was a single, unforgiving piece of geometry. An aircraft that a ship wants to hit is never where it appears to be by the moment the shell gets there. The plane is moving, the shell needs many seconds to climb to it, and in those seconds, the plane travels a long way across the sky. So, the gun cannot be pointed at the aircraft. It has to be pointed at a spot in empty air where the plane and the shell will arrive together, and that spot has to be found again and again as the plane changes course and height. Working out a target's future position over and over fast enough to matter was past anything a crew could do by hand with pencils in the seconds available. Here is what the machine did. High on the superstructure, mounted as high as the ship allowed for the longest reach of vision, sat a director, an armored rotating box with men and optics inside it, and, more and more as the war went on, a radar antenna fixed to its roof. The director held the target and passed what it sensed, bearing and elevation, and, from the radar, precise range, down to the plotting room below. The machine took those numbers and, running without pause, generated a moving solution, a live prediction of where the aircraft would be, refreshed many times every second. That solution went back up the ship as orders to the guns, which trained and elevated themselves to match it with no hand turning a wheel. The full loop from target to solution to gun closed in seconds. Even against a target at the far edge of range, the machine could settle onto an answer in something like 12 or 15 seconds, and at the range where a diving aircraft committed to its attack in far less than that. That was the thing the captured flyer could not put into words. From his cockpit, the American ship seemed to know where he was going before he knew himself. In a mechanical sense, they did. A box of gears 3 decks down was living several seconds ahead of him, and the guns were laid not on him, but on his near future. Riding on top of all of that was the second half of the answer, the half that had brought down the fleeing bomber off Guadalcanal on the 3rd salvo. The shells had been given a tiny radio in the nose, a miniature transmitter and receiver that sensed when it had come close to a solid object, and set the shell off at that instant with no need to strike anything. It turned the near miss into a hit. A round that passed within 50 to 100 feet of an aircraft now burst on its own, scattering fragments through a volume of sky many times larger than an ordinary timed round could ever threaten. In the first year of their use, 5-inch rounds fitted with the device brought down aircraft at better than 3 times the rate of the timed ammunition they replaced. One plane for about 150 rounds, where the older kind had needed some 500. The fire control machine placed the shell in the right piece of sky. The little radio in the nose finished the work from there. The officer who escorted the very first crates of those fuses out to the Pacific would, later in the war, arm the atomic bomb aboard the aircraft that carried it to Hiroshima. There was even a doctrine that told each gun where its work began. The 5-inch battery opened first and far out, past 12,000 yards, throwing the special shells at the incoming aircraft while they were still minutes from the ship. The rapid 40mm and 20mm guns held their fire until the range fell to a few thousand yards, then took over the close work with a storm of automatic fire. The layers were meant to hand a diving attacker from one to the next, so that surviving the reaching fire of the big guns only delivered him into the wall of the small ones. None of these pieces, taken by itself, was a miracle. The gun was superb, but not magic. The radar had blind spots, gaps directly overhead, and low against the sea where its own reflections confused it. The prediction assumed the target would hold a steady course and speed, so a pilot who threw his aircraft into a hard, ragged, changing weave could smear the solution and buy himself a few seconds. Even at its finest, the system was wasteful, spending hundreds of rounds for every plane it brought down, and the honest bookkeeping of the war handed most of the real destroying to the close automatic guns in the last few thousand yards, not to the 5-inch battery reaching toward the horizon. Diving attackers went on getting through, right to the end. What the machine did was tilt the odds so far toward the defender that the attacker could no longer plan round them. That was the thing the other side had no reply for, because the reply was not a gadget that could be copied over a winter. It was the entire apparatus standing behind the gadget. It was the director and the radar and the computer and the shell, designed to work as one body, plus the plotting rooms full of trained men, plus the written doctrine that ranked the guns and timed their fire. The enemy had none of that assembled. Their standard heavy anti-aircraft director had come into the war already too slow for the aircraft it was meant to bring down. After the disaster at Midway, they rushed a successor into development, a better instrument leaning partly on ideas lifted from British equipment captured at Singapore, and the prototype was never completed. Most of their lighter guns were laid over open ring sights, a man squinting through a wire circle and judging the lead by feel the way a hunter swings ahead of a bird. On radar, they trailed about 2 years behind, an eternity in that war, and their own experiments in radar-directed fire never left the bench. They had fine guns in places and brave crews in every place, and nowhere a machine 3 decks down living in the target's future. When the fighting ended, American technical teams went into Japan to look for themselves. They walked the naval yards and the ordnance depots and the fire control shops, took the enemy's equipment apart, and wrote it up mount by mount and instrument by instrument. In the depots stood the slow old director that had carried Japanese heavy anti-aircraft fire from the first day of the war to the last. On the drawing boards lay the half-built pieces of the replacement that never arrived. Bolted to the mounts were the open ring sights and the optical rangefinders, careful and disciplined engineering that had begun too late and reached too low. All of it went down in the flat, patient language of a technical report and was filed away, and somewhere in those pages is the answer the flyer in the wire compound never received. The fire had found him so fast because, aboard the ships he attacked, a machine had been solving him the whole time, and aboard the plane he flew, and in the entire Navy that had sent him out, no such machine had ever existed at all. The hidden machinery behind the battles can be as gripping as the battles themselves. Subscribe, and the next piece of it gets taken apart the same way.